all of us who work in traditional publishing are constantly being inundated by submissions from people who would like to publish a book to a degree that is usually, 20 times what we would have the capacity to publish.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Your Business, Your Next Level. I'm your host, Eunicia Peret, and today I have someone special here in the studio with me, Doug Seibold. He is a writer and an editor who started Agate in his basement in 2002 with a laptop, a cell phone, and an internet connection. We've heard about some amazing companies being started that way, haven't we? Further on in 2006, he expanded by acquiring Shuri Books and started Agate Development, an educational content service provider that does work for hire for large textbook companies, associations, and corporations. And then subsequently in 2024, he launched Agate Publishing Academy, which provides training and information for people that are seeking to advance their careers in the field. Listen to this, in ways that is designed for it to be more focused, more affordable, and more accessible than existing alternatives. And Doug, because I'm all about how do we put money back into our clients' pockets, I love that last little bit. How do we make it more accessible than existing alternatives? Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
It is my pleasure. I would love to hear a little bit from you about this beautiful journey of yours. Clearly, it's been tried and true. You've done some amazing things with your companies. Tell us a little bit about how did you get to where you're at?
Well, I think the main thing was really feeling kind of ill-suited for the work world as I was experiencing it, when I was in the earlier years of my career in the 80s and 90s. It took me a while, but ultimately I kind of figured out that part of why I was feeling the way I was feeling about what I was doing was because I was struggling a little bit working for other people and working within the constraints of, a more conventional work arrangement. I never thought I would start my own company. I never understood myself as somebody who would be an entrepreneur. And it was a slow evolving process. But ultimately, I wanted to control my own destiny. I had ideas about how I thought I could make a company in our industry, which is a very mature and low margin industry. I had ideas about how I could make my company successful. And I had ideas about ways in which I could grow it and diversify it that ultimately I've been able to pursue over these past 24 years now.
I love it. And for our listeners, how would you sum up if somebody's listening, they're an entrepreneur? We have a lot of unbelievable entrepreneurs listening to the podcast. That's who we're speaking to. If they're listening to this, why is this episode important to them? If you could summarize it in one sentence.
I think it's because I hope I can show you that if you know a lot about your field and about what you're doing, and if you have a vision, for a place in sort of your industry's larger ecosystem, and you have the energy, then you can make something work. You can make a company of your own work.
Of course. That's beautiful. All right. So what I'd love to do now is to dive into your area of expertise, which is media and publishing. Tell us a little bit more about how has media and publishing transitioned in the 21st century, and what are you seeing on that front?
Well, it's been a rough century so far, Eunicia, for a lot of media and publishing, and in particular for newspapers, magazines, and a lot of these legacy kinds of media outlets. The changes wrought by the advent of the web, roughly 30 years or so ago, were very challenging in many respects for these legacy models, but created a bunch of new models in terms of opportunities on the web itself. The breakdown of the advertising model that really followed the 2008-09 financial crisis was also very challenging for that particular part of our industry. But throughout all of this, book publishing has remained more stable and more consistent than a lot of other traditional sort of written media have been. And it's not as though there hasn't been a lot of tremendous change. The rise of the commercially viable ebooks about 15, 16 years ago represented a period of great instability and unpredictability that ultimately took about 5 years to even out. And right now we're dealing with a tremendous period of very unpredictable change with the rise of AI. So never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment. Talk to us a little bit about what are you seeing with the AI and how should folks think about AI in terms of the risk in developing and demonstrating what you call cognitive capacity? And also there's obviously a huge fear about the impediments and the challenges with intellectual property. The framework around the intellectual property, how can people control what they have to where it's theirs when everything seems to be out there? And, folks are being told, put everything out there because then you'll be more searchable. And the challenge is, no, you probably shouldn't. And how should you, especially when so much of the framework seems to be changing, it feels like by the moment.
Well, there's a lot of separate sub-questions, to unpack inside of that, Eunicia. But I think the biggest thing right now up front is you have a very uncertain legal environment around AI right now. And Agate, among many other publishers and writers, is participating in a large settlement with the AI company Anthropic, which was found responsible for an inappropriate reuse of copyrighted material. And there is going to be an enormous payout to companies like Agate and to many writers whose work was swept up by Anthropic in terms of developing their large language model. I think that case is probably going to be a bit of a bell cow for other cases that are going to be brought against other AI companies for intellectual property licensors like Agate and intellectual property holders like writers. And this is kind of wide open right now. I think it's very uncertain sort of what direction things are going to go. I think one thing that is also very, very uncertain and turbulent is how the government is going to regulate AI created content in terms of copyright. For the time being, people that are producing content that is largely AI generated are unable to copyright that content. And if you are in an intellectual property business where you have a business model that's dependent on commercializing copyrighted and trademarked material, it raises a great deal of questions about what you're able to do with AI in terms of the full extent to which you could employ it in producing material that you would then try to sell to your customers. Pretty much in every aspect of Agate's business, we're seeing an impact from AI. And then I think in our education business, this is one of the biggest areas of uncertainty. How we're going to teach language learners to read, how we're going to teach them to write is certainly going to be changed by AI. How teachers practice in the classroom, how they work with students, what they require of students in terms of assignments and in terms of tests is going to change because of AI, and what expectations we have for people as they go into the workplace in terms of their language and communication skills, and then also their critical thinking skills, which, as I see it, are very, very closely tied to their abilities as readers. And this is something that affects everybody in the workplace and not just people that work in media businesses like mine. All of this stuff, I think if anybody is telling you they know what's going to happen, I think they're being a little overly optimistic because there's great uncertainty right now in terms of where all of these things might go.
100% agree with you, Doug. And one of the things that we're seeing, I literally just happened to have jumped off of a call with someone that was referred over to us by one of our existing clients. And this gentleman, super, super smart. He literally went out there, talked to a lot of different companies, has done his research. And he actually pointed out, he said, I've done my due diligence. I've looked on even using AI. And he said, I'm afraid that even a lot of the things that people are finding online, they're polarized. It's this or that, it's due, and they're polarized and they're very attractive in a way. And he said, I know people that have actually gotten themselves in trouble by listening to certain things that were not necessarily applicable to them, but it came like it was a nice idea because it was fine because it was on AI or ChatGPT or whatever they got it from. At the end of the day, they caused themselves a lot of harm financially, because there's still the differences and the nuances that sit behind the decisions that need to be made are not quite as easy as black and white, especially in our world when we're dealing with individuals that they have complexities in their financial outlook and picture overall. How do you see, especially parents? I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs who have younger children and they are asking themselves exactly what you said, right? How can they help their children thrive in an environment where the information is so readily accessible, the tests seem to be outdated? How does a parent train or educate a child in today's day and age based on what you're seeing?
Wow, that is such a great question. And it's something, very dear to my heart as somebody who's worked in education and parenting related fields, going back over 20 years now. I think, I have two adult children now. And one of the things that I was very preoccupied with when they were younger was helping them to become enthusiastic readers. And so that was something that I feel like from when your kids are very, very young, it's really important for there to be a great deal of reading material in your home, a great deal of reading material available to your kids that you read with them, that parents read with their kids. It's very important for kids to see their parents reading and enjoying reading, being able to read things in common, things like a daily newspaper, which I think is a great addition to a home in terms of people being able to pick up different sections of it and discuss it and share it. These are kind of bulwark ideas from the 20th century that, as I see it, are still valuable and still meaningful to parents in particular, who are trying to help their children learn how to value reading and what reading has to offer them in terms of their own development as people, and then also value media, to value publications and books. This is not a short-term thing, as I see it. This is something that, like in so many aspects of child rearing, really requires a lot of application, a lot of consistency, and should become something that, if this is something that is important to you as a parent in terms of your own children, they see you valuing yourself. They see you putting your time and your energy into interacting with them around these sorts of things in the way that it would be with any other sorts of things that you value, in your family.
I love the fact that you made the parallel to they see you valuing yourself, because frankly, a lot of successful professionals, they're busy. Everybody's got a super busy lifestyle. It feels like there's never enough time for anything. And so the question among many of those individuals is, how do we find the time to actually give back to ourselves, to take care of ourselves? And what more beautiful way than to pick up a book and have reading time with the family and with the children, versus everybody's on their iPads and their tablets and their computers, and it becomes this super segregated environment where people don't even really feel with each other anymore. Can you comment on what you've seen, and can that be undone? That's one of my fears. Have we gone as a generation, as a society, so far one way that it's hard to bring back the family time and the time when people have dinners together without the children being on their iPads or cell phones during the meal itself?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like you mentioned mealtime. I tended to be the sort of parent who really believed in quantity time as opposed to quality time. I tended to feel that, making space in as many days out of the week as you possibly could for things like a family meal or for, bedtime reading. These were kind of the bedrock of how you helped your children develop the way that they thought about these sort of things, whether you're talking about it in terms of their values or you thought about it in terms of their habits and their practices. Children are always watching you as parents. They're always seeing what you do. And if you're saying like, well, you need to eat healthy food, and then you're breaking into a bag of chips, or if they see you saying, well, you should be, in your room reading and you're sitting in front of a television set, you're not necessarily modeling the most, productive behavior, towards that aim. I think people need to embrace these things for their own sake as well as for their children's sake, and again, it's like so many other things involving developing productive or useful habits. It's about consistency. It's about application. It's about making mindful choices about these things. And you're not necessarily talking about huge expanses of time for this, but you are talking about consistency, which I think is really important here. You might be talking about something that could entail an hour or 90 minutes out of your evening. And if that's an hour or 90 minutes that you're not spending doom scrolling or watching television, but instead are spending with your children, doing these other things. I'm a partisan for reading, Eunicia. I mean, that's my
Clearly.
field. That's what we're all about. But I see these larger larger values for that in terms of people's well-being and people's, sort of intellectual capacities. And I see it as going beyond entertainment and more towards, cognitive ability. And, I'm a businessman. I see this about people's capacities to be, an effective professional as well. All of these things are sort of bound together. And these are all things that parents can make a big impact on their children with from a very early age.
Absolutely. And you talked about the cognitive ability. What I feel like a lot of individuals don't really understand is the fact that being in front of, especially for a child, being in front of the computer all day, every day, or the laptop or whatever, the iPad or whatever it is, it impairs their ability to actually to think creatively. Yes, they might be able to regurgitate the information that they've heard. How do they apply it in practice is totally different, because now they're not, instead of them using their creativity and allowing their mind to do the work and find all the things, it's being fed through a screen. And it's just something that I feel it would be nice. More parents would live with fewer regrets as their children age if they had the opportunity to, maybe revert to more reading and more time together, as you said.
I think there's so many different ways to approach this too. Is like, I'm one of those people that's like more is better. I'm a both and person, especially when it comes to like books and reading. One of the things that everybody in publishing knows is that children, even very young children, love books. If you put them in a room full of books, they're going to find something that they like. And for very little kids, that means board books and picture books. And for slightly older kids, it might mean comic books or graphic novels. I think that, beautifully illustrated magazines are something that are as appealing to kids as they are to adults. And all of these are ways in which people can sort of not only build their abilities for reading, but also, I think, connect a little bit to the world of written material. And I felt like I certainly remember when my kids were just so in love with comic books. I'm like, are they ever going to want to read a book that's just, print on the page? And, yes, they did. My kids still love comic books and graphic novels, but they love all kinds of books now. And I don't think parents should be afraid to expose their kids to all of those sorts of things.
We had a period, especially with our son, where comic books were the thing. And I had the same question. How many more of those books am I going to see? He's become of an avid reader since. And yes, he still loves comic books to some extent.
I still love comic books. So
I never really quite got into the comic books, I have to tell you. It feels like the more I read, the more I want to consume knowledge that is a value add, not just to me, but then I can take back to my clients. And sometimes I'm reminded by my own coaches and mentors that, it's okay to read something that's not heavily focused on value, to allow our minds to disconnect and to focus more on ourselves. I feel like that's something else that folks need to hear, that not the fact that they have the permission, the fact that they need to grant themselves the permission to disconnect and to allow their minds to dream. Speaking of dreaming, I want to shift gears just a little bit, because one of the things that we touched on from a topics perspective was the idea of how to create what do you see as far as being able to create opportunities for aspiring publishing professionals outside of postgraduate education. And where I'm going with this question is, there are a lot of entrepreneurs that would love to perhaps publish a book. And this was the topic of conversation literally last week over self-publish, publish with a publishing house that provides or promises the moon and the sky, and you get very little on the other end sometimes, as well as in some cases, the authors don't even really own their work. What is that in-between world, and what can you enlighten our listeners with on that front? What should they be thinking about if the thought of writing a book perhaps has become top of mind for them?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I like to say about publishing is that in the 21st century, it's easier than ever to get published, but it's harder than ever to get paid. I mean, when the internet came along in the form that it's in now by the end of the late 90s or so, the early 2000s, you had the most powerful and the most equitable publishing mechanism ever known in human history. Anybody can post anything on the internet, and then anything that they post on the internet can be accessible to anybody else who has access to the internet. And there's never been anything remotely like that before. But what happened fairly quickly was that you had what became entirely new issues of discovery, of curation, and of distribution. because when you have hundreds of millions, if not billions of web pages, how does anybody find your work? And we're seeing something similar to that right now in terms of the difference between self-publishing and traditional publishing. And I think self-publishing is fantastic for a lot of folks that are perhaps, let's say they have access to a market of readers that they can reach directly. They don't need to go through retail or other channels in order to reach readers, but instead, let's say maybe they have a newsletter, maybe they have a speaking business, maybe they have other ways to sort of aggregate readers, and they can get their work to them through that direct channel, not have to go through all these other mechanisms. Self-publishing can be a great resource for folks like that. Similarly, it can be a great resource for folks who cannot find any opportunities in traditional publishing. Because remember, traditional publishing, it's not a matter sometimes of choosing traditional publishing. It's a matter of whether publishing chooses you.
Correct.
Because all of us who work in traditional publishing are constantly being inundated by submissions from people who would like to publish a book to a degree that is usually, 20 times what we would have the capacity to publish. And everybody who works in traditional publishing, whether you're talking about agents or publishers, book reviewers, retailers, we're all in this similar state of overwhelm. There's far more people who would like to publish a book than we have the capacity to produce. And probably also then there's a readership to consume on the other side of that. So there's a couple of key ideas to understand about what publishing means that I think are important for people to understand when they're looking at this decision. And one is that the flip side of this idea of gatekeeping, which has all these implications of being, anti-democratic or constrained or reclusive or exclusive, is this idea of validation, this idea of investment. In publishing, everybody is investing their time and energy, and in publishers' case, their money in a book because we believe we're going to recoup it through sales to readers. So to that extent, we are investing time, we are investing money towards that end. And Eunicia, that kind of investment comprises an important kind of validation. And this idea of validation is very, very important in terms of what most people are looking for from being published. It's not necessarily always a great way to make money, but it is a way to sort of earn a kind of validation that comes from all of these other entities saying your book is worthwhile. Your book is something that we think there is an audience for that is also going to find worth in it. And when you self-publish, you are essentially circumventing that entire validation process. Rather than having all of these other parties invest in your work and validate your work, you are paying for that. You, the author, are essentially the only person who is saying, my work is worthy of this kind of investment. And that means very different things. Still in our world, there's a legitimacy and a validation that comes from publishing that is simply not present in self-publishing. And this is not even going into these questions of what kind of opportunities do you have as somebody self-publishing to reach a paying audience for your books. It can be very difficult to get your book reviewed in traditional media or to get your book carried in stores if you're self-published because those places are already overwhelmed by the books that are coming to them from traditional publishers, which remember have gone through that validation process.
They have the funnel, which is already overwhelmed there. When you've got all of the publishing houses outputting all the books, it puts an equal strain on the distribution.
Yes. So I think anybody considering publishing needs to keep those ideas in mind. Not only this access to the marketplace, but also this question of validation, which is supremely important in fields like academic publishing or medical publishing, where people, get professional advancement through going through the publishing process. The validation part of it is even more important than the marketplace aspect of it. So I think these are important things for people to keep in mind.
Those are beautiful ideas. One final question there before we shift gears again. One of the things, Doug, that this, again, back to the conversation from last week, there was a lot of guidance from someone to say it's better to go kind of with an in-between model so that individuals own their work and they can use it in white papers and whatever else. Is there something that perhaps was misconstrued in that guidance? It was provided to a room full of people.
Yeah.
Is there something something that might have been misconstrued in that situation that would have made those people to go with that particular solution that was offered? Or is it truly that whenever people are seeking more of a traditional publisher, that they have to be careful as to, are they actually continuing to own that work, or do they relinquish it to the publisher?
So I think an important thing to understand, Eunicia, is that publishing is a licensing business. For the most part, most traditional publishers will license the rights to publish a book, and sometimes, a paperback version of a book, and sometimes an ebook or an audiobook from the author, but that the author retains their copyright. I think any author should be very leery if a publishing company were to come to them and say, we will publish your book, but we are going to control the copyright. A publisher will control the license. And what that means is that the author can't go to another company and say, I want you to also publish my book, or they can't say, well, I'm going to take my book away from the traditional publisher and then go to another publisher without regaining their access to the license for what they're doing. I don't think this is always necessarily very well understood by folks outside of publishing, but the way that our industry mostly works is the author retains the copyright, and then they make a deal for these very, very specific and prescribed licenses that then the publisher controls after that point.
Thank you. That's very helpful, because last week, as I was hearing this, I was thinking it sounds too much like a sales spiel of sorts. And I would imagine that there has to, yes, of course, always be crossing your T's and dotting your I's. Buyer beware. In this case, writer beware. Just know what you're getting into and make sure that you're dealing with the right people and you have the right team on your side as well.
And there are great resources out there about how these different kinds of publishing work. And, but it is a little hard. It is a little bit opaque. And a big part of what I'm trying to do with Agate Publishing Academy is make all of these things less opaque. And publishing doesn't need to be such a black box. But it is something that for a long time has been a mystery to too many people, I think.
I agree with that. Doug, one of the questions that I absolutely love to ask during our interviews, and this has been, the time has just flown by, which means that I've had some fun. I've had a lot of fun learning more about publishing and learning more about even just how to give yourself some time by reading and having a great time with family members or those nearby. What is, if you were to look back in your history, what would you say is the biggest failure or regret? And what was the lesson or the lessons that you learned on the other side of that perceived failure?
My gosh, I feel like so many. I think for me, certainly the period of time when I was in the wilderness or in the woodshed trying to start Agate was just overwhelmed with failure. It was like I was trying over and over again to figure out one potential avenue after another to get my company started. I kept on telling people year after year, like, I'm so close. This is going to be the year. And it just didn't happen. So I think that that's something that has really stayed with me. And what it really did was it made me understand that, nothing is promised. Everything has to be fought for and achieved. And I think that was, an incredible experience. It took much longer than I thought it would to get the company going. And in some ways, I wish I could have gotten started sooner. But in other ways, it really made me value the opportunities that came to me when they did. But I have to tell you, Eunicia, I tend to be the sort of person who is kind of constantly thinking about these experiences of failure in my past and struggling with that, to kind of move forward. And objectively, I've been running this company that's been a going concern for almost a quarter century now, but I'm always running scared a little bit. I'm always afraid that, failure is right on my heels and is about ready to kind of sink its teeth into me. So it's kind of hard to pick one failure.
I appreciate the vulnerability, Doug, because the reality is there are so many entrepreneurs out there that we all know them. They have a great idea. They're working on it, kind of like you did, right? They're taking their time. Maybe they were never an entrepreneur prior to that, and they just need their own validation through the process, and they're going to get somewhere. For sure they will. And then at the same time, we also see the entrepreneurs or the wannabe entrepreneurs who are claiming that they're going to do something. And they might start, they might do something, and then next thing you know, they're on a different trajectory and they've changed directions, and then they change directions again. And so then you look at the individuals who are out there doing it, just maybe incrementally, you don't see a whole lot. And at the same time, when it's big, kind of like what you've done with Agate, it delivers a lot of value. It's got a purpose. It's got a meaning. So while it's probably not the easiest thing to share, I appreciate you sharing it, because what you've done is you've given the individual that's out there doing the thing that's hard, you've let them know that continue doing what you're doing. There's beautiful light on the other side.
And you can always learn from these experiences, which I think is crucial, because not everybody has a primrose path. It's not everybody is just seeing a succession of open doors, and learning from the hard things and from the challenges, to my mind, just makes somebody better and more effective when they're in the driver's seat and actually being able to make the decisions and run their organization, once they've got it up and going.
It absolutely does. No, I really appreciate that. Doug, without further ado, we are unfortunately at the end of our time here in this episode. However, I'd love to ask you one final question. Based on our conversation today, is there a morsel of goodness or an idea that's maybe top of mind that you would like to share with our listeners? I find that sometimes those ideas are just full of pure gold.
I think the thing that has been something that has stayed with me in running my company is that you need to always be thinking about what is the next thing or what is the other thing. When you work in a field that has been as turbulent and as, just powerfully affected by change, you need to have the resilience and the creativity to keep thinking, like, how else can I adapt what I'm doing? What other things do I know how to do that I can deploy to sort of make a part of my business? That has been something that I feel like has been a real difference maker for Agate. And I tend to feel like everybody that's running a business needs to be open-minded about ways to see beyond, what's right in front of them, no matter how absorbing or compelling that is, to be thinking about what could be next.
I appreciate that, Doug. That is so, so powerful. Thank you once again for being here in studio with us today. And as we're concluding this episode, what Doug just said is absolutely huge. And the reason I will tell you it's huge, at least from my standpoint, is we see that happening, or the lack of that willingness and desire to step outside of the proverbial box that people are in, when at least when we're talking about finances, it's there and it's just full blown. And obviously you're seeing it in other areas as well, publishing being a great example. So if you're there and you have that angst, of that gut instinct that you need to be doing something, whether it be about publishing your book, clearly you've got an additional resource if you needed somebody in your corner, or it'd be on the financial side, or it'd be in medicine, whatever it is that you're dealing with, just take that step and take a chance on making sure that you have the right people in your corner, because without the right people, you stand the chance to experience a lot of potential failures and maybe not optimal results. And with that, I leave you to it. Make sure you stay tuned for your next episode of Your Business, Your Next Level. And do us a favor, go in and review this episode and let us know what was the one thing that stood out to you the most from our conversation here with Doug today.
Thank you for joining us on Your Business, Your Next Level podcast, where it is all about helping you make more, keep more, and elevating your business to the next level. To learn more, make sure you head over to www.podcast.excelstra.com and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show. Again, that's podcast.excelstra.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.